It's my very great pleasure, in fact, to be introducing two very good old friends from NUI Galway. Mary Harris is a senior lecturer at the National University of Ireland, Galway. She is author of The Catholic Church and the Foundation of the Northern Irish State. Her teaching and research focus on modern Irish history. She's coordinator of NUI Galway's programme commemorating the 1916 Rising and is a member of the Irish government's expert advisory group on commemoration. Today she'll be talking about Romanticism and Realism, Patrick Pearse, Eoin MacNeill, the Revival and the Rising. Adrian Paterson is lecturer in English at the National University of Ireland, Galway, director of graduate research in English, and chair of the Humanities Research Committee. He's curator of NUI Galway's Yeats on the West exhibition for Yeats 2015, which you may have seen the poster downstairs. And he is, I would say, he's published widely. Well, he's the author of Words for Music, W.B. Yeats and Musical Sense, which is forthcoming. He's published widely on 19th and 20th century literature and writes with particular interest in the artistic interactions of modernism and the fin de siècle. He will talk about Ballad and Story, Rann and Song, Yeats's 1916. But first we have Mary Harris, who will be talking about Romanticism and Realism. Thank you very much, Mary.
Thank you very much for coming. And thank you very much to Dan and Eileen for organising this event. Let's see. Okay, my paper concentrates on two figures who were enormously significant in 1916. The person on the left, Patrick Pearse, as many of you know already, of course, came to be seen as perhaps the greatest icon of the 1916 Rising, and no one else had explained and discussed the whole idea of rebellion in so many different forms, political speeches and plays, for example, in advance of the Rising, so that after it had happened and executions occurred, people could look back and say, aha, this is what he was talking about. And the person then on your right here is Eoin MacNeill, the subject of my own research project at the moment, who is very much opposed to the Rising. And I wanted to talk about the relationship between the two and their different perspectives. Now, a key moment in the drama of 1916 came in the early hours of Good Friday morning, when Eoin MacNeill and Bulmer Hobson, a member of the Volunteers and the IRB, on foot of rumours that Hobson had heard that a rising was present, they went off to St. Enda's, Pearse's school, and confronted him. In the early hours of the morning, Pearse was obliged to admit that, in fact, yes, a rising was planned for the following Sunday. MacNeill, who was Commander-in-Chief of the Irish Volunteers, who would constitute the main fighters in this event, was furious at having been deceived and, convinced that circumstances were unfavourable for a rising, determined to call it off. Sometime afterwards, hearing German guns were on the way, he relented, but he was to change his mind again when new information reached him. On Saturday, he heard that a document detailing Dublin Castle's plans for drastic security measures was false. Whether or not it was false is another matter. MacNeill heard that German guns were lost, in fact, and that Casement, returning from Germany, had been arrested. Having conferred with various other figures, he proceeded to countermand the military manoeuvres that were going to be the pretext for a rebellion on the following Sunday. Now, this confrontation, quite an ugly confrontation between the two, judging by MacNeill's account and Bulmer Hobson's, this was an unfortunate clash between two enthusiasts who had shared a passion for Irish language and Irish literature and had worked together on many issues for almost 20 years. They both yearned for Irish freedom and sometimes shared platforms. Nevertheless, at other points, they appear foils of each other. And a comparison between the two helps to highlight the differences and the difficulties that arose in this period. The early 20th century was a period of great optimism and great involvement and engagement with cultural and political events. But nonetheless, there were differences as to strategy, different types of calculation as to what was likely to work. And indeed, by 1912, the period 1912 to 1916, these differences become more stark, partly because the situation itself was changing due to the Unionist challenge to Home Rule, and due to the outbreak of the First World War. But even apart from that, there is evidence of people becoming impatient at what hadn't actually materialised. And the sense, I think, of what Yeats probably had in mind when he talked about people being troubled by the long gestation of the event presumably being Irish independence. So a comparison between Pearse and MacNeill highlights the difficult decisions and different calculations. And this can be seen in connection with their attitude towards the language issue, the Home Rule crisis, the formation of the Volunteers, and the rebellion itself. Now, when they first met, they were both in the 1890s wildly enthusiastic about their discovery of Irish literature that is in the Irish language. And the publications of the era conveyed a sense of excitement that many people felt. MacNeill himself wrote an account of Irish literature in the New Ireland Review in 1894, and there he talked of, for example, the authors of early Irish literature being men of deep, acute, original thought, of bold, comprehensive view, of fine aesthetic feeling and subtle taste. And this has to be seen against the background of what Conor was talking about earlier, in the sense of cultural humiliation. And here we have MacNeill discovering that, in fact, his ancestors had been people who have high intellect and sophistication. And MacNeill was lamenting the fact that this wasn't better known, and indeed lamented the state of research on it, and considered it a matter of national concern to carry out research, which he believed offered unlimited interest and zest to all who engaged in it. Now, he emphasised the imaginative qualities of the literature and the expressive potential of the language with its extensive vocabulary, all of these, of course, pointing to a high degree of intellectual achievement. In a sense, there is a strong sense here that he was arguing against the grain. He was indignant at ignorance of Irish literary heritage and attributed this to the limited teaching of Irish history. He referred to those of Gaelic blood as hewers of wood and drawers of water, in war the mercenaries of a stronger race, and determined to invert this type of cultural and intellectual hierarchy. Now, Pearse in the same period was wildly enthusiastic also, and 3 lectures he produced, or he gave, and were subsequently published in the 1890s, indicated this enthusiasm. More than 12 years MacNeill's junior, he was somewhat naive. He was only 17 when the first of these was delivered. But he was clearly very fond of superlatives. He said, for example, there is no literary production of any age or nation so entrancing as Irish literature. And he commented on the descriptive power of the language, better adapted for description than any other language. So this was, of course, the language of an enthusiastic 17-year-old. But he also shared a sense of indignation at the lack of appreciation of what was indeed part of the Irish heritage. And then through their work in the Gaelic League, and of course Eoin MacNeill himself was a founder member, a co-founder of the Gaelic League, which was geared towards promoting and preserving the language. Both of them were heavily involved in this, Eoin MacNeill playing a leading part and trying to bring Irish literature to a wider audience. MacNeill sought to elucidate various points of Irish language, Irish grammar, literature, folklore, in a number of publications, including the Gaelic Journal, which he edited for a time. Both Pearse and MacNeill were involved at different stages in editing the Gaelic League's newspaper, and Clive Sullish, and used the Gaelic League's publication committee to try and create an awareness of Ireland's heritage. Now, the case has been made by Roisin Ní Harvey, Máire Ní Lahuin and others for harnessing aspects of post-colonial theory to provide context for Pearse's views at this point. I'm not a post-colonial theorist myself, but I do think this is worth investigating. Ní Harvey in particular has talked about the inversion attempted by Pearse in his publications, and his desperate attempt to bring a marginalised, occluded literature to a more prominent position. And the same, I believe, would probably be beneficial in relation to MacNeill as well, because certainly they were both people who had a definite sense of mission in all of this. Now, moving on into the 20th century, we find Pearse in 1908 with a new plan for promoting the language, and this is his plan to set up a new school, which was to be St. Enda's. At the early stages of the planning, he corresponded with Pearse, and the correspondence is quite interesting in terms of what they expected. He, for example, was talking about setting up a high school for Irish boys, and believed that this would be very influential in terms of promoting the language. MacNeill's comment was quite sharp and blunt in response. He said, for example, here, I cannot at all agree with you that any course of instruction at school will produce really Irish-speaking children unless there is a domestic foundation or its equivalent. I fear you have in mind some imaginary state of things which does not exist. Now, I'm using this really because it prefigures arguments that were going to be made in the political context later. Your school-taught language will never be more than a simulacrum of the living thing. The contrary notion is a fatal delusion, especially for us. If it is persisted in, it is certain to ruin most of our work. So this is quite sharp. Now, Pearse had also asked him if he'd send his own sons to St. Enda's and if he could contribute financially. He said he couldn't contribute financially because the Gaelic League owed him money for publications, but he was indeed to send his two eldest sons were to be among the first students at St. Enda's. But the correspondence continues back and forth, and MacNeill does point out that it would be better to start at junior level rather than at high school. And he's also interested in, of course, the financial issue is significant, but what Pearse does is proceeds to provide a school ranging from junior to higher level on a promise of money that didn't actually materialise, but the lack of money never deterred Pearse from any of his projects. But it is interesting to see the different temperaments here at this particular point. The two young MacNeills, at any rate, Neil and Brian, appeared, for example, in the Abbey Theatre, and they were in the cast of Henri, one of Pearse's plays that I think Adrian is going to refer to shortly, that was staged alongside Rabindranath Tagore's post office in the Abbey with view to raising funds for St. Enda's. Nevertheless, despite this cooperation on the school venture, there were some serious differences of opinion. And these are recounted in MacNeill's memoirs written in the 1930s. He said, it's not too much to say that Pearse allowed himself to be carried away with the notion of the Cuchulainn model. Now, if you know anything about St. Enda's, you'll realise that much effort and emphasis was placed on drama and sport. And there was a very conscious attempt to encourage people to emulate the heroic figures of Irish folklore and mythology, particularly Cuchulainn. Now, continuing, MacNeill says, my sons Neil and Brian were among his earliest pupils at St. Enda's, and when the boys came home, they used to tell us how Pearse was continually talking to them about Cuchulainn. Then he said, the danger of this line of thinking is plain enough. It teaches young people to regard their country or nation not so much as a thing which they should serve, but rather as a stage upon which they may expect to play a part in a drama of heroism. And that notion has become very widespread among younger people down to this moment. Besides the heroic ideal of this kind, certain mystical notions were at work. The nation itself became disembodied in some of their ardent minds and became reduced to a sort of mystical abstraction. So we have here a certain degree of resentment, I think, towards the theatrical element of Pearse's thinking. And it's interesting also to see how they viewed other figures. For example, both of them were quite interested in Fionn McCool and the Fianna. And Pearse used to emulate Fionn McCool's figure in folklore, whose band of warriors were known as the Fianna. Pearse used to call on his students to emulate these also, and he used, for example, he used to refer to their motto, which ran Glina Norngri, Nart Norngi agus Bart Dre, which means, roughly translated, purity in our hearts, strength in our limbs, and deed according to our words. And in the Fianna Éireann Handbook, which was Fianna Éireann being a Boy Scout book, or a Boy Scout movement, Pearse contributed an essay on Fionn McCool and the Fianna, and he created this wonderfully idyllic version of what life was like in the age of the Fianna. But he does point out that ultimately the Fianna came to an end because of internal divisions, but it's told here more or less as a morality tale. Elsewhere, he refers also to Fionn McCool, and Caoimhín Branagh, in his article examining Pearse's attitude towards Fionn McCool, talks about how subjective and selective indeed all of this is. On the other hand, while MacNeill shared Pearse's fascination with these figures and indeed with the life of the Fianna, he said, for example, in truth, nearly all our ancient literature was written within 12 paces of nature's own domain, where the writer was a constant dweller, not a visitor. Very idyllic in its own sense, but he was far from idyllic in his depiction of Fionn McCool. and notes, of course, that Fionn McCool was bound to exact vengeance because his father had been killed before he was born. But he's very grim, and he's almost fascinated by this dark side of Fionn McCool, and refers to the burden of vengeance and of fate, which casts a dark shadow on the more intimate folds of his mind and heart. He is cautious, subtle and deliberate, darkly vindictive, never wholly placable, sometimes well-nigh treacherous, a really negative depiction of the heroic figure that Pearse has. And Pearse knows, of course, that Fionn had a treacherous side. But just to maybe cut this discussion somewhat short and proceed, it's worth bearing in mind that one of the greatest acts of treachery recognised by both Pearse and MacNeill, but particularly maybe of concern to MacNeill because of the treachery involved, is the death of Diarmuid O'Divna on Ben Bulben. And coincidentally, MacNeill's own son was to be killed on the slopes of Ben Bulben during the Civil War some years later, which would, of course, the comparison and the significance of the area would have been very obvious to MacNeill himself. Now, moving on from the whole question of language and literature, 1912 was a year, it seemed like the year of Home Rule. And it raised a lot of questions about where the national movement was going, and a lot of questions about the connection between literature and politics. It raised, for Pearse, certainly serious issues, because Pearse was prepared to support Home Rule, believing anything was worth taking if it gave the possibility of control over Irish education, but he saw it very much as a first step. And it's clear from this publication on Bár Bua, which has been recently edited by Andreas O'Casig. This is a short-lived publication that ran for 11 issues, an Irish language newspaper, where Pearse discusses his attitudes towards politics and other political figures. And here he's clearly oscillating between the whole romanticism of the armed struggle and the possibility of home rule and settling for something less in the short term. Now, even before An Bár Bua began publication in March 1912, Pearse had published a poem, Fernach de Chonacú, which is really seen as the opening salvo almost to his commitment to the armed struggle, which includes this verse, the Hugus Machúl Nashling the Chumas is an road some Rome Maig the Hugus. I turned my back on the dream I had created, the dream presumably being this Gaelic Ireland that he aspired to. Is an road to Rome Maig the Hugus, and I turned my face on this road ahead. And then the last verse is probably the best known. The Hugus Muchanui Sharon road to Rome Gniv the Keem is an Mas the Yod. I turned my back on I turned my face on the road ahead, on the deed I saw and the death I will die. And he followed this with various poems published in An Bár Bua. One, for example, Mion, where he invokes various dead figures, the saints, Sarsfield, people who died for Ireland, the corpses of the famine, all with view to coming to this determination at the end to swear to free Ireland. Now, another poem he published at this period was Misha Éire, which is based on Irish ideology or Irish mythology and the personification of Ireland as a woman. And in this case, he talks about the woman, Misha Éire, Sinna Ménon Chailech Vera, and then he talks about the pride in having given birth to Cuchulainn, Múr Machlóir, made the rug Cuchulainn Croga. But then he turns to something else, Múr Manor, Machlawn Féin the Yiel Amaher, great my shame, my own children have sold their mother. And this has to be seen in the context of Home Rule debates at the time, because he was concerned that Irish politicians, in their desire to find a resolution, would actually settle, would not scrutinise the legislation carefully enough. So we find in him certainly part of his brain is very much focused in 1912 on rebellion, but at other times he talks in more qualified terms. He sets up an organisation, for example, called Cumann na Saoirse for Irish language speakers. And he talks about how he would never advocate anything that would go against the teaching of the church. He would never advocate, or the organisation wouldn't advocate revolt unless there was a reasonable chance of success. And very moderate in his views, but all of this is to come to an end fairly shortly. He did also appear in 1912 on a Home Rule platform along with Eoin MacNeill. and argued that it should be supported, but said if we were tricked this time, there's a party in Ireland, and I'm one of them, that will advise the Gael to have no counsellor dealing with the Gael, but to answer henceforth with a strong arm, the sword's edge. If we are cheated once more, there'll be red war in Ireland. And this indeed marks the direction he was taking. But nonetheless, there is this oscillation, which certainly comes to an end by 1913, where he's much more focused in his thinking on the whole question of rebellion. And also in 1913, we find, for example, a series of poems published in the Irish Review, a very fascinating magazine. The series is called in Irish Dántha Gríosa Gael, and in English he calls it Irish Rebel Songs, but the Irish is more expressive of what he had in mind. It means poems to incite the Irish, which were geared basically to stirring up anger and were, let's say, inflammatory, to say the least. Now, during this period, Eoin MacNeill also had appeared in the same Home Rule platform in 1912, and Eoin MacNeill had a different set of concerns. He was increasingly worried about Ulster opposition to the notion of Home Rule, and particularly the emergence of the Ulster Volunteers, which he saw would be quite difficult to put down. And he expressed some of his views in an article in An Clogh of Solish, the Gaelic League's newspaper, an article called The North Began, where he expressed delight at the fact that Ulster Unionists were prepared to stand up against the British government, and suggested that they were home rulers of a sort, and also suggested the possibility of forming an Irish volunteer movement. Pearse was taken by surprise when this appeared, because he had been thinking along the same lines, and a week later he published a very strong article strongly advocating fighting and bloodshed, which he saw as being something of a noble thing, and foreseeing in the years ahead various different groups, all, let's say, he says here, enterprises undertaken by sane and insane persons, by good men and bad men, many of them seemingly contradictory, some mutually destructive, yet all tending towards a common goal, and that objective, the Irish Revolution. And this is more or less what happened, but you note here that none of the groups here includes anything cultural. And in fact, in 1912, in the An Bord Bua, he specifically states at some point, he recalls various enterprises Irish people had expressed or expended energy on: the land question, the university question, the language question, the women's question, believes they should all be shelved and people should focus on the Irish Revolution. And indeed, when an Irish volunteer movement was formed very shortly after that, Pearse and MacNeill were the leading speakers on the night of the 25th of November. And Pearse, at the time, said he recognised that various people present thought enough freedom could be achieved within the empire, others believed not, and he said he was one of those who believed not. But at any rate, he said Ireland armed would make a better bargain with the empire than Ireland unarmed. And we find in the rhetoric of the Irish Volunteer launch, the rhetoric used by both MacNeill and Pearse, there's great emphasis on the need to self-assertion. And the argument is being put forward by MacNeill that to give in to the pressure against Home Rule would amount to a degradation, the term slavery and degradation being used continually at this particular point. Now, there was also an assumption that the volunteers would lead to a transformation of those who were involved, because of the discipline that was to go with it. And in fact, Pearse had said on the night of the launch that for the past 100 years, Ireland was like a mob trying to be a nation. And he believed that if people were more disciplined, their chances of achieving independence were much included and much improved. And the actual change that was envisaged does seem to have occurred, because Clark wrote to John Devoy in 1914 talking about this change, and the people who had taken part in the volunteers and people who had been considered wasters were now turned into energetic soldiers. Now, over the next few years, MacNeill remained very heavily involved as leader of the Irish Volunteers. The movement itself split on the question of involvement in the First World War, and MacNeill led the group who strongly opposed this. And much of his own activity was in the form of journalism in this period. He produced, for example, an Irish Volunteer newspaper. And some of the key issues, just to explain very briefly, one was imperialism and anti-imperialism. He came back to this term, not usually in referring to any particular area, but nonetheless the idea of the British Empire. Imperialism is the only enemy, the phenomenon, let's say, of imperialism, rather than particular areas where imperialism existed, though the Irish Volunteer newspaper did actually carry articles on India. Imperialism is the only enemy that Ireland has known since the Battle of Clontarf. he also talked about the likely outcome of the volunteers. But here I am struggling to figure out how exactly he thought this was going to happen. But he believed that a self-reliant Ireland, a united Ireland, a strong Ireland, this, he says, is what makes a free Ireland. And in the face of such a union, the qualities of imperial legislature would find its work, as far as Ireland is concerned, reduced to accepting and placing Ireland's own measure of national right and liberty. It's as if the British government are going to be so impressed by the disciplined organisation that they will just hand over power. Also, here this raises questions as to what MacNeill thought. He quotes here from Thomas Davis, a much revered figure in this era, "Let the cowards stand aside, we'll have our own again. Let the brawling slave deride, here's for our own again." And MacNeill, "Let the young man who's not a coward or a slave explain why he stands aside and derides or looks on with indifference." But it's still not clear where all of this is going, because he certainly wasn't thinking in terms of any rebellion in the near future. And he had argued that the organisation was to be a defensive organisation, to defend the rights of Ireland, not an aggressive one. But ultimately, the possibility of keeping people year in, year out training without some kind of action seems perhaps far-fetched. However, other people were planning the action. And we have already indications of people becoming discontented with the cultural movement. For example, Mary Cullum, a very interesting commentator in this period, who once taught in one of Pearse's schools, St. Ita's, talks about a conversation she had with MacDonagh. Now, she went to America in 1914, so presumably it was shortly before she went. And MacDonagh said, "This country will be one entire slum unless we get into action. In spite of our literary movements and Gaelic leagues, it's going down and down. There's no heart in the country." And we know that by 1916, MacDonagh had come, even before being invited to participate in the plans, he had come to the conclusion that this was the only way forward. And we have from the poet Austin Clarke, for example, a reference to being inside in MacDonagh's lecture. MacDonagh takes out a gun, puts it on the table in front of the students and says that Ireland can only win freedom by force. He remarked, Clarke says, as if to himself, put the gun back and continued with the lecture. So undoubtedly there are other figures as well, like Eamon Ceannt, for example, and Joseph Plunkett, who both became involved in the IRB. And Pearse himself is becoming increasingly radical, as is obvious from his graveside oration at 1915, where he talks about being baptised in Fenian blood, and he exalts the military struggle to an extraordinary sense. Now, by the end of 1915, it's clear that Pearse was not the only one was thinking in terms of rebellion. It's clear that Connolly was thinking likewise. And by early 1916, there were grave concerns about what Connolly was going to do, whether he would have a rebellion that would trigger a massive crackdown on security, rounding up all advanced nationalists and ruling out the possibility of any other form of rebellion. We know that behind the scenes, Pearse, Plunkett and Ceannt had from 1915 onwards been planning a rebellion. Now, it's often pointed out that this was not a democratic rebellion. It didn't have the consent of the people. I might point out that not only did the rebellion not have the consent of the Irish people, it didn't have the consent of IRB members as an organisation, which according to the IRB constitution it should. It didn't have the consent of the Supreme Council President, Dennis McCullough, who spent quite some time trying to figure out whether the rumours of a rising were true or not. And it didn't have the consent of Eoin MacNeill, of course, who was head of the Irish Volunteers. But nonetheless, it went ahead. Now, in the course of planning, there were grave concerns about Connolly going it alone. And Bulmer Hobson, who was closely associated with MacNeill, talks about meeting Connolly in early 1916. He told me that the working class was always revolutionary, that Ireland was a powder magazine, and that what was necessary was for someone to apply the match. I replied that if he must talk in metaphors, Ireland was a wet bog and the match would fall into a puddle. No, this is very much MacNeill's thought as well. He thought this is totally not on. And he, in February 1916, drew up a lengthy memorandum justifying or arguing that a rebellion could only be justified if there was a reasonable chance of military success in the near future. And he goes through a range of Republican arguments like we'll be disgraced forever if we don't revolt during the war. Irish revolts have failed in the past because they happened too late. The advantage lies with the person who takes the initiative. He went through them in turn and demolished them all, and argued that this was definitely not the time for rebellion. And he passed this on to Pearse, and he was of the opinion at the time that Pearse agreed with him on certain things. He was quite unaware that Pearse was actually involved in the plot for rebellion. Now, when the rebellion, to return to our starting point in 1916, which is Pearse finding out, or Pearse admitting to MacNeill that the rebellion is actually imminent. And this, of course, was a terrible shock to MacNeill, who determined to call it off. We might point out that the one constant in MacNeill's life, and he didn't die until 1945, but the one constant was his scholarship. And even on Holy Saturday, in the midst of this turmoil regarding whether the rising was going to be on or off, a colleague, R.A.S. McAllister, turned up unexpectedly at his door with the proofs of an Laur Gawala that they'd been co-editing. So they spent 2 hours discussing this. And McAllister, who gave evidence later at his court-martial, said he had considered MacNeill and his wife to be in great form that afternoon. But obviously MacNeill was quite tormented, but maybe a better actor than we think. Then, despite MacNeill's great efforts, we know that the rising went ahead on Easter Monday. One of the great theatrical moments, it seems to us in retrospect, though not at the time, is the emergence of Pearse from the GPO shortly after it had been taken over to read the proclamation proclaiming the Republic. And this seems, in retrospect, to be perhaps theatrical. We might note, however, that if the rising had gone ahead and as planned, this wouldn't have happened at the early stages of the rebellion, because it took all of Sunday from about 9 o'clock in the morning until the early hours, in fact, of Monday morning to produce the proclamations for technical reasons. So Pearse had his great moment through the inconvenience of MacNeill having actually delayed the rebellion. We have a description of what happened for MacNeill himself. He was utterly tormented when the rebellion broke out. We know that he was concerned for his own safety. He thought about going to some safe house, contacted some religious order, who we think might be the Jesuits, but is not entirely sure, but they didn't want him. He ended up going to the Augustinians in Orla in Rathfarnham, and he talks in his memoir of an unpublished memoir of going up the hills of Killikee and looking at Dublin and being there alone, feeling utterly distraught. And later on, we know that he went back home and he ultimately was to be arrested. And that probably saved his period of internment, probably saved his political career. Now, looking back over this, we could see that at various points, Pearse had, in fact, appeared very unrealistic in comparison with MacNeill. But nonetheless, Pearse's calculation worked out more accurately than MacNeill would have thought. Pearse had, of course, written a poem in 1915, a poem called The Fool, and he did ask, well, what if the dream come true? And something fairly similar. This is MacNeill talking about Pearse in 1919. And here he's actually claiming that another part of this article, he talks about his having brought MacNeill or brought Pearse into the Gaelic League. That's not true. That he can't really claim credit for this, but MacNeill had a very bad memory. But he acknowledges here that Pearse had accurately calculated the impact of the rising. He says his vision was fulfilled and his forereckoning was completely justified. That day decided his fate, also decided his country's destiny. Ireland has many heroes and martyrs in her memory. She'll remember Patrick Pearse as hero, martyr, teacher and prophet. So here, in a sense, it appears that Pearse has been more realistic in terms of his calculation of what might happen in the past and what wouldn't. Now, time is short, so we cannot go into what happened with the War of Independence, but I'll just point out a few things. The War of Independence ended with a truce and the treaty, which didn't bring the republic that Pearse had wanted, but it did bring far more than Home Rule would have offered. MacNeill was drawn into political activity during the War of Independence. He was an elected member of the Dáil, and he had various portfolios, and ultimately was to be involved in the Boundary Commission, which failed to resolve the boundary issue. During this period, he himself found the whole business of politics very distasteful. And when we look ahead to what happened after independence, it must be acknowledged that a lot of those who had noble ideals earlier on and dreamt the dream, whatever that was, hadn't really foreseen the needs of a bureaucratic modern state and all the trappings that went with it. And indeed, in some respects, it was quite different from what was expected. So I want to quote two people by way of conclusion, maybe, looking back over these, because Pearse, as I said, he calculated accurately up to a certain point, but the result was not the same. MacNeill lived with the outcome and later on he felt quite annoyed that there was so much emphasis on the state and that the enthusiasm for nationality had waned. Here Foster concludes, this is the very end of his Vivid Faces, he says, to know the dream of the revolutionaries, it may help us to strip back the layers of martyrology and posthumous rationalisation to get back before hindsight into that enclosed, self-referencing, hectic world. Now, whether it was really that enclosed or self-referencing, we could question. But nonetheless, he talks about trying to see how a generation developed, interacted, and decided to make a revolution, which for many of them may not have been the revolution they intended or wanted. And in this case, we must see that, of course, MacNeill hadn't intended it, but nor did he want exactly the type of thing that materialised. Pearse had wanted it, but perhaps it wasn't what he had wanted either. He would have been horrified, of course, to see what happened afterwards, and in particular to see the way the curriculum was drastically narrowed to promote space for teaching of Irish, because he himself believed in a very broad education. But it just finish maybe with one final comment as we reflect at this point of commemoration on what was achieved and what wasn't. And Mary Cullum went to the States in 1914 and didn't get back until after the treaty. And there she talks initially about the excitement of getting back and onto Irish soil with its own flag now and its own government officials with their own uniforms, etc. And then she talks, however, about that enthusiasm, that initially, the sense of being enthralled at this independent state waning, as she found a lot of people despondent because of what was achieved and what hadn't been achieved. And some of them were annoyed at partition, some of them because it wasn't a republic. But she also raises this interesting question. She said it was the widespread anger against the settlement had not everywhere the same basis. For some, it was not so much that it fell short of the national aspiration, so much as that the old secret romance with Kathleen Ní Houlihan was over, with the little dark rose, the poor old woman, the silk of the kine, all the symbolisms through which a romantic passion for the country had been expressed for generations. Now that romantic symbol was taken from them, or partly from them, there was a sad bitterness as over a lost love. So it was in a sense that a moment was lost. And just one final comment from Mary Cullum. She talks about meeting with some friends of hers and seeing Countess Markievicz. She goes to AE's house, actually George Russell's. And there she sees Countess Markievicz, she said, and refers that she had known Markievicz in her vibrant maturity, the height of her beauty and her courage, and she commented that she lived strongly and passionately several different lives, but now seeing her sitting quietly, she said she was like an extinct volcano, her former violent self reduced to something burnt out. So I'll leave you with this thought as regards the cultural ferment, the political ferment, and its demise. Thank you.
There's a tendency, while I wait for this to be called up, there's a tendency in these 1916, 2016 commemorations to use culture, I think, as a safe alternative to politics. I'm not sure culture really does or should provide this safer space. I'm not a historian, and a lot of what we've heard so far is history. I'm a literary scholar originally, but I guess I'm interested in not only literature but the other arts and culture as a historical force. The Easter Rising of 1916 was an act of theatre. Sort of thing people say very often, and we've heard even MacNeill and Pearse, or Pearse particularly, talking about this possibility. We become accustomed to descriptions like that, to say the Easter Rising of 1916 is an act of theatre. It's so familiar, in fact, it's almost a cliche. But what does this really mean? And that's one of the questions I want to ask today. To describe this rebellion as theatrical, I suppose, is a useful shorthand for historians, apart from anything else, especially those who are sceptical about the long-term goals and prospects for rebellion that took place without significant arms or men, not to speak of the short-term order, counter-order, and disorder that marred its opening. Historian Garoda Tui recently has talked of the great theatre of the Rising, and in an RTE interview just last week to mark the 1960th anniversary, the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, was at pains to point out that the integrity of these people's performance in the week is not to be questioned. That there is even a perceived need to suggest the rebels' actions are not merely play acting is itself interesting, I think. If what this is about on these terms is if the rebellion or the rising was a gesture, as some suggest, then it was a sincere gesture, at least. I think this appears to connect the event all the more to the contradictions of performance and associated concepts of gesture, of tableau, of setting, drama, actor, statement, speech act, song, and so on. Now, if we were to entertain this as a conceit, what, if anything, does this have to do with actual theatre or actual performances before and after the 1916 Rising. What kind of performances were they, and how did they marshal their theatrical resources, their actions, their stagings, their words and songs and so on? Is theatre really the best lens, after all, to look at what is unquestionably a real event? Well, thankfully, in a sense, the plays and poems of the period are self-conscious enough to consider this possibility and these questions themselves. And thus their works open up, I think, important themes of inevitability, of free will, of artifice, of realism, of audience, not to mention authenticity and legitimacy, which, of course, are important historical questions. So after considering theatre's close connections with 1916 and then its increasing evocation of songs and ballads, I'll close with just a brief look at Yeats's somewhat overlooked play about the Rising, The Dreaming of the Bones, that's published latterly in this 1921 volume 4 Plays for Dancers. The play is a strange thing. It's a Japanese no play, but set in the west of Ireland. It's a historical play set in the present day. It's a play of realities featuring ghosts and a dance play whose chief life is in its songs. As Sue mentioned early on, I'm the curator of an exhibition called Yeats in the West that's been on in Sligo. Well, it's been on in Galway, now in Sligo. If you're in Sligo next few weeks, go and have a look. And some of the things are downstairs. Some of the panels are downstairs from that thing. In a sense, this has been a kind of process of discovery for me. I'm a Yeats scholar, and thinking about that was interesting. So, in a sense, this is still a Yeats-centric view, but it's not just about literature, it seems to me. It's got a wider impact. This is the headline of the exhibition, and here's a few examples of the panels about song and about place, about revolution, which I think is important and matters here, and some of these images and items I'll be talking about today. It is Yeats-centric. This is Yeats in 1915, looking slightly in movement, I think. Arnold Genther is also known for his photographs of the San Francisco earthquake, and there's something about Yeats that's unfinished, and he writes about himself in his autobiographies as being this kind of unfinished person, as if at nearly 50, his life is yet to be a fulfillment of its hopes. Talking about the 1916 Rising in theatre is not new. Yeats's late poem, The Man in the Echo, asks an anguished question about this play, Cathy na Húlathán. And the poem refers to Cathy na Húlathán, written in collaboration with Augusta Gregory, in which an old woman, through symbolic utterances and song, calls an engaged man out to take part in the 1798 rebellion. You can see that the scene is set in 1798 in Mayo. Yeats's question, oh, that's not Yeats's question. Sorry, I don't know what happened to... Actually, that's very strange. This has become very reordered. Okay, Yeats's question is, did that play of mine send out certain men the English shot? And, yeah, there it is. And this is a real question for Yeats, I think, but one that latterly people have been rather sceptical about. It's met with a sceptical response. That play is Cathy na Húlathán. Really, does it have so much to do with the Rising at all? His lines seem to be mocked by Paul Muldoon in his poem 7 Midder Street. If Yeats had saved his pencil lead, would certain men have stayed in bed? 7 Midder Street, you might know, it's in Brooklyn. It's about a New York artistic community set in a house that included for a time Benjamin Britten, Kurt Weill, the children of Thomas Mann and others. It's less often noticed, I think, about this line that like Yeats's Man in the Echo, this is a dialogue poem. 7 Midder Street is a dialogue poem. So actually, Muldoon is not speaking for his own voice. He's actually playing the part of the skeptic here is Whiston, i.e. the poet W.H. Auden, who lived in that house. And here he appears as kind of disaffected, detached, a soon-to-be American citizen who's escaped the war and its demands. He's contradicted by Louis MacNeill, who actually is about to return home to, or return to London, in fact, to write for the radio, as Yeats has himself done. So Auden himself is kind of recanting his early view as a 30s polemicist, playwright, and poet, most certainly a politically engaged poet who wrote about and spent some time in Spain in the Spanish Civil War. His insistence in his epitaph for Yeats that poetry makes nothing happen is not maybe the last word here. Yeats would have disagreed, and I think Auden and MacNeill, Auden's younger self, would have disagreed with himself there. Plays and poetry, of course, aren't the same thing, but where they overlap in meeting the world is part of my topic today. One thing we can say is that this late poem of Yeats recalls emotions he expressed at the time. Shortly after the Rising and its executions, he wrote to the New York lawyer and benefactor of modernism, of James Joyce and Ezra Pound and others, John Quinn, we have lost the ablest and most fine-natured of our young men. I keep going over the past in my mind and wondering if I could have done anything to turn these young men in some other direction, he says. And points out that he knew several of them. Knew several of the executed men, and others were familiar figures. In a letter to Augusta Gregory, Yeats has already begun to frame this event and its aftermath as theatrical. Speaking of miscarriages of justice, of people he knew or thought he knew, without trial of any kind, who were imprisoned and shot without trial of any kind, he comments, "The Dublin tragedy has been a great sorrow and anxiety," and repeats the thought of Maud Gonne, "Tragic dignity has returned to Ireland." So you can see the longer quotations there, but it's no wonder, I think, in this context that his poem, Easter 1916, which he's already begun writing, as we can see there, I'm trying to write a poem on the men executed, a terrible beauty has been born again. That refrain gets tightened up in the telling. This poem stages the rising as a tragedy, as we can see this. Each of the rebels, in other words, resigned his part in the casual comedy. That's life, presumably, by dying. His knowledge of its players is noted here, not just the dead men, Pearse, MacDonald, and McBride, but also Countess Markovitz among those named and talked about in this poem. He stages his ambivalence. I'm sure you're familiar with this poem, but just to mention it, he stages his ambivalence to the rising in these questions that have been noted already. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. And this revision of the cliche, all that is said and done, I think it matters. It's interesting, isn't it? It allows a rhyme with dead, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. But it also provocatively inverts the usual order of things. Deeds are first, words can only follow after. And I suppose that's the situation this poem finds itself in. Maud Gonne, of course, didn't like it. She says to him, "No, Willie, I do not like your poem. It's not worthy of you, and above all, it's not worthy of the subject." But its framing of this event has proved, I think, enormously influential. The poem represents also a revised retrospect. Its central event arrives to revise a view of the whole cultural revival, in fact, as well. In other words, all that was said before it was done. And as Yeats puts it in his Nobel Prize-winning speech, after Parnell, and this is the famous, maybe too oft-quoted remark, but it's worth saying here, I think. After Parnell, a disillusioned and embittered Ireland turned away from parliamentary politics. An event was conceived, and the race began, as I think, to be troubled by the event's long gestation. And many others have echoed him on this point. He also talks about the fact that Hyde founds the Gaelic League, he himself founds a movement in English, and the need for a theatre, and talks about the great mass of people. So theatre becomes a kind of educational event, I think. And I think there's something interesting about even this kind of slight elitism of this kind that connects him with Pearse and others who are thinking of theatre as a way of educating an audience. And the rising was educating an audience, leading people somewhere they're not ready to go yet. Now, historians have taken this seriously. They found they had to, I think. FSL Lyons and Roy Foster, among others, but perhaps reluctantly have said, well, is this true? And this sense that the Cultural Revolution was central to the rising, I'm quoting again from Michael D. Higgins, is common even today. One of these cultural events that kind of neutralises, I think, the strange effects of the rising on Monday, Michael D. Higgins gave an interesting speech, really good speech, but he name-checked Yeats and Douglas Hyde and Augusta Gregory and J.M. Singh and Sean O'Casey, all playwrights, we notice, as being part of this cultural revolution. But, I mean, can history really be prefigured, roused, or caused in some way by plays? Well, Yeats's other way of writing about this is to make a parallel of kind of light and dark, I suppose, that talks about creating the ground and creating audiences. He talks about his own theatre pieces in this journal, Samhain, that's issued from the Abbey. They were written at a moment when Ireland was preparing in that dark portion of the mind, which is like the other side of the moon for insurrection and anarchic violence. And one notes both these comments, of course, come after not only the Irish War of Independence, but also the Civil War. So this is a kind of retrospective view that even 1916 has, a revised retrospective view, the poem Easter 1916. We can see some evidence for this at the time. This is the proclamation of independence that you know very well. Joseph Holloway, who was the architect of the Abbey Theatre and an inveterate Dublin playgoer and diarist, saw this in Dublin and took it to be a playbill. At first, before reading it properly. And this moment of misprision, of misreading, was not so far off the mark in some ways. This proclamation was produced in two parts on a printing press, as Mary says, throughout that that difficult Sunday. That printing press was hidden for nearly a year under the stage at the Abbey Theatre, the same stage that Joseph Holloway had designed. The Abbey actor who hid it there is a guy called Arthur Shields, later hid his gun there too, and actually on the morning of Easter Monday, he's ordered to fetch it by his commander, and he brings back in its place, oh, that's just the whole proclamation. Oh, don't know what it's doing there, come back. I'm hoping for his script. Yes, here it is, a script of the Spancel of Death that he takes back to the Abbey Theatre and takes his gun out, and then has to go, he's not where he should be, so he ends up going to Liberty Hall to fight there. The point of this is the fact that Kathleen O'Houlihan, this play, The Spancel of Death, Arthur Sinclair's playing, he's in one of the characters in this play, which is a kind of 18th century peasant drama, to use that term, is playing alongside, of course, Kathleen O'Houlihan, which is due to play on Easter Tuesday, which is kind of interesting too, isn't it? That this performance of Kathleen O'Houlihan was, of course, cancelled due to the real thing being performed on the streets just outside. And Abbey Street was one of those streets that nearly gets almost wiped out by the shelling. Shields himself returns to the Abbey and plays Michael, opposite Augusta Gregory, as Kathleen O'Houlihan. Is this going to work? Oh, it will work in a minute. Yeah, here's the picture. That's Augusta Gregory, who the only time she played in this, she co-wrote the play with Yeats, so knew the play pretty well, and plays the old woman there. At moments like this, you're tempted to talk, as my colleague Adrian Fraser does, about Oscar Wilde's comment about life imitating art more than art imitating life. Life tries to copy art to reproduce it in popular form like an enterprising publisher. I don't mean to say that Kathleen O'Houlihan is the only theatrical event that matters in talking about this. I've got a whole section that I won't talk about here really about the other plays. Kathleen O'Houlihan was only 20 minutes long, and in its first performance it was occupied with the stage by A.E. George Russell's play Deirdre, which he wrote, he says, because everybody nowadays seems to be writing plays. And Dublin at this time, according to Maureen O'Hewley, who did a recently republished memoir, The Splendid Years, says that Dublin was a city that was theatre mad. Recent, of course, theatrical scholarship has wanted to widen our scope to not thinking Dublin is just theatre mad about the Abbey and other things. It's preceded by the Irish Literary Theatre, and also what becomes the Irish National Theatre Society, then the Abbey. Many of the plays from that defect in 1906 and form the Theatre of Ireland, under the presidency of Edward Martin, who's been involved in all these theatrical movements, with the Abbey stalwarts, the Fay brothers, and people like Porritt Colum, as well as Eoin MacNeill, Countess Markievicz, Eva Gore Booth, Thomas MacDonagh, and Porritt Pearse. We can look. It's not just true in Dublin. I think we can look outside that. I think it's got out of place, but this little slide I'm looking for, excuse me, here is a feis in Crowell in Galway. This little figure here is Douglas Hyde. W.B. Yeats is at the top there, Lady Gregory sitting in the bathroom. That's Jack B. Yeats, who does all these little sketches. This is a feis in honour of Raftery, about Irish singing, dancing, storytelling, but also play acting as well. And Douglas Hyde is actually performing one of his own plays, Cashel and Sugon, The Twisting of the Rope, with the wonderful moustache that he had. This is John Quinn, the New York lawyer, who's influential from all this. So that's Galway, but we can look at Cork and Daniel Corkery, Terence McSweeney, Bulmer Hobson in Belfast, as being kind of influential places. Lennox Robinson goes to see the Abbey tour in Cork and then starts writing plays, writes The Patriots, which then influences Sean O'Fwyllan and others. There's a sense even thinking about Terence McSweeney, who writes very differently from Yeats in some ways, talks about the standard of playing needs to be higher, but also says that theatre should be nakedly patriotic and propagandistic. But also, goes on hunger strike. He's seen Yeats has played The King's Threshold, in which a poet goes on hunger strike for his beliefs. So there's something slightly odd about these connections, I think. What matters, I think, is that, in this context, I suppose, it's not really surprising that Yeats, one of his responses to the Rising, should be in a play. It's surprising, I think, there's no play, but we'll come to maybe why that might be. To go to Porritt Pearse in the Gaelic League on Clive Solis. He says the Anglo-Irish dramatic movement has now been in existence for 10 years. Its net result has been the spoiling of a noble poet in Mr. W.B. Yeats and the generation of a sort of evil spirit in the shape of Mr. J.M. Synge. So we think, well, Pearse isn't that keen on the Abbey and what it does. But he's also, I think, evidently a disciple of Abbey acting, of elocution, and of its programming. And in another article for the same newspaper, he repeats Yeats's call for players to be still on stage and elocute properly. And goes as far as to suggest that those hoping to put on Irish plays should first study the art of the Irish traditional reciter, and second, pay an occasional visit to the Abbey Theatre. The one puts the student in touch with Ireland, while the other puts him in touch with the best contemporary ideas. We hope, he concludes, we've shocked no one by mentioning the Abbey. So he's aware his audience won't necessarily be Abbey-friendly, particularly after J.M. Synge's The Playboy of the Western World, but I think he's including this as part of his thinking. In time, of course, Pearse puts plays on in the Abbey. Mary's already mentioned that in June 1913, Henri, or the King, was staged alongside Rabindranath Tagore's The Post Office at the Abbey. And again, we've mentioned Tagore several times actually now, and this figure, Tagore, is someone that Yeats translates and makes very important from 1912 onwards, his series of poems, Gitanjali. Yeats is interested in Tagore partly, I think, because he has an access to a spoken and sung tradition, that Tagore's poems were actually spoken and sung, particularly sung. They were songs that people actually remembered. And Yeats is very interested in this kind of tradition. Pearse, when he's putting on his plays, and this is what I'll come to, this idea of song, which is what this broadside is doing here. When Pearse puts on these plays, like Henri the King, or his play Owen, or The Master, which are often devised at and for St Enda's School, and sometimes are fundraising things for St Enda's School. They often feature children who unquestionably follow their teachers into danger due to a kind of vital simplicity that they have. You can't quite term it innocence, because they're often trained cheerfully to hold guns pretty well. All of these plays show the influence, the marked influence, I think, of Kathleen O'Houlihan, as well as Yeats's schoolteacher plays like The Hourglass, as the national symbolism behind this special calling and sacrifice is more and more nakedly revealed. And they also, and this is why I'm interested in song, they also all feature song in some ways. Song is seen as central to the formation of this national idealism. Kathleen O'Houlihan, of course, includes these set-piece lyrics, translated by Gregory and worked on by Yeats, as really the central argument of the play in some ways. Pearse's Henri notes, or when he translates it as the King, notes that the music of the fighters makes drunk the hearts of young men. In Owen, it's a ballad singer who brings along the news of the 1816 Fenian Rising, while the Master has this young favourite, Yolland Beg, composing a single four-line rann. Rann is the old, is a four-line grouping in Irish, before he's kind of climactically sacrificed at the end of the play. So, in other words, ballad references and the singing of songs are adopted as a theatrical convention to convey to an audience a vital conduit to what are seen as native nationalist traditions. The fact that Pearse's very last play is, well, performed after his death in 1916 is called The Singer, gives you an idea of the connection here. Quite a few people, Connor mentioned his ballad about the gun-running failure. I mean, ballads, Thomas Davis and others have a whole history of talking about how Irish history should be written in ballads and calling for ballads and music and other things. Even, I suppose, Dion Boucicault and others are putting ballads on stage as a kind of, despite the kind of stage Irishness of some of Boucicault's things, there are ballads there to indicate, I think, a kind of authenticity. And this happens at the turn of the century. It has a new intensity, I think, because there are plays by Constance Markievicz called The Memory of the Dead, or by Alice Milligan called The Wearing of the Green. They actually take the titles of popular national ballads or nationalist ballads. Pearse's plays don't always leave room for the kind of complex readings that are available in Kathleen O'Houlihan. Kathleen O'Houlihan is really can be read, I think, as a tragedy about the breakup of a family through this extramarital intrusion in the form of these national love songs. But, some of these plays do complicate these things. Augusta Gregory's play, De Virgile, which is a major source for Yeats's Dreaming of the Bones, Mona, who's one of the characters there, muses on the action and thus on heroism. That is not a thing you would be hearing in the ballads, as if that was somehow new and strange and different. And the character Flann is clearly by the notes of the play, is clearly reading dangerously against the grain by assuming that all coming danger can be dismissed. Thus, what does it signify? What is it but a vagabond song that was born in a minute and will vanish away like a wisp of smoke? And again, these kind of song stagings are what feature in Shauna Casey's play about the rising, the plough and the stars. Bessie, the unfortunate Bessie, dies with a kind of ballad on her lips, and with heavy irony, the play actually closes with Tommies, the British, singing Cockney songs. Anyway, Yeats's poetry, of course, has already staked this claim to Ireland in the coming times. He says he will follow in ballad and story, rann and song, people like Davis, Mangan and Ferguson. Although it also makes the claim that he will be allowed to distance himself from a purely nationalist or propagandist point of view. But he's not written ballads for a while, actually, by 1916. He knows very much that ballads have come back into currency. This is, the image here is really by his brother Jack B. Yeats, which is this broadside publication that features from several years, from 1908 to 1915, actually of ballad singers doing the singings. The broadside singers, those broadsheets, they're actually singing their wares for a penny or a farthing. At his sister's Cooler Press, E.C. Yeats. So this is a Yeats family example of what might be possible in ballads. And Jack B. Yeats's ballads, actually, or the broadsides, feature rebels of all kinds, outsiders of various kinds. We've got pirates and cowboys and clowns and musicians, as well as ballad singers and actors and other people. They do have a kind of contemporary currency. They're fine art objects as well, because they're limited prints, but the currency of these was made clear to me just earlier this week. I was shown by our great archivist in Galway, Barry Houlihan, a broadside. That's an example that Catherine Houlihan, Mangan's poem, is used as one of these broadside ballads. This is January 1915, and the actual one where, if you notice here, it's signed to Arthur Shields with deep appreciation and recollection by Connolly, who's the author of this ballad. And this is a typical kind of four-line ballad, newly written. I'm not quite sure in what circumstances and printed here. Connolly meets Shields, this actor and partaker in the rebellion, after they were both interned after the Rising. And then, so this inscription here marks a kind of interesting shared experience that's cemented over song and ballad and culture and those other things. You can take other examples that this is, Dermot O'Byrne is a pseudonym for the composer Arnold Bax, who originally starts writing kind of Yeatsian-influenced tone poems, but then becomes a ballad writer. The Rising demands, I think, that he becomes a kind of pseudo-Irish poet, and he writes kind of heavily Yeats-influenced national ballads in this book in 1916. So I think in this atmosphere, it's not surprising that Yeats responds to the Rising in ballad form, which he does here in two ballads that you may know, The Rose Tree and 16 Dead Men. The Rose Tree actually ends up as part of this broadside series. This is a later broadside series in 1935 that W.B. Yeats is much more heavily involved in. And this old symbol, the rose tree, that he uses in his poem, that he's used, in fact, since the early 1890s, becomes the Liberty Tree, reborn, with decoration here with Harry Kurnoff. And all these ballads, I think, enter into the atmosphere of the Dreaming of the Bones. In December 1916, when he's composing it, he notes that he plans to write another rebellion poem, finish my play, and then return to the dialogue. Perhaps the poem he's writing is 16 Dead Men, it's on the left there, which includes a kind of strange physicality of ghosts. Significantly, Madonna's bony thumb is the remnant that can't be outweighed here, on the bottom of the second stanza there. Okay. All right, well, the rhetoric in 1916 is interesting for all this, I think. This is about ballad song as well. It is Heaven's part, our part, to murmur name upon name, which, of course, is a ballad singing tradition, to name historical figures. And, of course, when he writes out in verse, he does that in the very same thing. Also, to a number of people in the song, this choice of numbering suggests, I think, those printings and numberings of broadside ballads, as well as the numerology that takes part in 1916. He also, of course, clearly mentions Thomas MacDonagh. Thomas MacDonagh is interesting to Yeats because of his theories about speech and song, and Yeats writes to him about the closeness of these things. Okay. To go to Four Plays for Dancers, this is it's a no play that Yeats writes about at the Dreaming of the Bones. It's a no play because it includes musicians and masks and dancers. This is the costumes for At the Hawk's Well, to give you an idea of the kind of thing that might happen. That's actually the guardian of the well, the dancer there, and this is a musician. And so this is a play that is concerned, I think, inevitably concerned with questions of music. And Yeats talks about this play. Excuse me, I'll go skipping through. He says, I've almost finished my Dervigilla play. I think the best play I've written for years. It's grown greatly since you saw it, and I'm afraid it's only too powerful politically. I have nothing more to write but the lyrics and must leave London for that. I think it's interesting in several ways. The fact the play is political, it is actually rejected by the bookman because it's too political a year later. We can see from the manuscript that it's sort of assembled. It's a matter of kind of patching and pasting the manuscript. But also that the lyrics, the structure of the play can be composed anywhere, but not the lyrics. He has to be in Ireland to write these lyrics. I think that's kind of interesting. And he does. He goes to Dublin and eventually writes that there. This is an example of the manuscript here. Okay, right. This is Corcombe Moraby, where the play is set. And the play opens in this way: why does my heart beat so? Did not a shadow pass? It passed but a moment ago. Which introduces this numerology, the symbolism of threes that figures throughout the play. And I think that matters because there are three musicians in the play. There are three characters, the three shite, the three actors in the drama. And of course, what happens in the drama is a rebel from Dublin is on the run in the west of Ireland near that abbey, and is taken and met by two people who tell him the story of the dead lovers who brought the Norman in, Dermot and Dervigilla, and accompanied by music, they kind of take him around the stage. And finally, after all this symbolism and music, he refuses them forgiveness. Never, never shall Dermot and Dervigilla be forgiven, and they're lost in their own torment, this kind of purgatorial torment, which I think is a circling roots, which takes in the number three, because three forms a circle, but also, I think, symbolized by the forward rhythmic propulsion of music. And finally, I'll just talk briefly about this final lyric, which does those two things, which is a sort of ballad lyric that goes wrong, really. It's got a fifth line. It shouldn't really have that. But it's actually emerged from this terrible temptation that's in this place to talk about a music of a lost kingdom that could suggest, of course, the old folkloric world of the west of Ireland or the civilizations of the east. Are we thinking of going to Clare Galway, to Eastern civilization, or to Dublin, where a new dawn has been arrived? Or because the music stops and stills itself, we're desiring its continuation, hoping even to find its source. This music is then dangerously attractive, a route to madness, and we might find ourselves caught in its sweet wandering snare. So does this represent the rebel's intoxication? Or does it represent the lovers that have been caught in the snare? It's ambiguous, I think, and we can't be sure. As the rebel heads towards Clare, and indeed finally towards America, is it prophetic? Are we supposed to see this ballad as being an example, like Cathy na Hoolan in Easter 1916, as a work about love and jealousy, and the temptation is to fall too much in love with Ireland? It's hard to be sure, but I think in this form, which takes this rann of 4 lines and spins it out to 5 in these phrasal patterns, suggesting a continuation as well as circularity and the bitterness of recurring dreams. An extra line, in other words, makes this not a military 4-square rann, a kind of military ballad, it makes it something else. So the patterns of music represent longing, but also the possibility, the necessity of reconciliation. And perhaps, therefore, art might imitate life after all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mary and Adrian, for 2 wonderful papers that brought to life the intimacy of the occasion of 1916, I think. We've time for 2 questions, I think, if you want lunch. Okay. Any questions? Oh, hello. Yeah.
Hi. So to connect this to the panel this morning, what is the connection of literature and folklore and ballad? And the idea of a reimagined national space that is so crucial. Like, what is about literature that's so tangible? Why not teach like agricultural science or geography or social studies, and tie that into the idea of the mystical abstraction versus like self-reliance?
It's a good question, isn't it? Why? I don't know. Why?
Why is it?
you want to answer that first? I mean, well, there's a historical tradition, of course, for thinking. Particularly, I was talking about theatre and ballad song, and that they've always had those traditions. As I was suggesting, I think that something like the theatre movement, or indeed this kind of reanimation of ballads that Jack B. Yeats and W.B. Yeats take part in, is in part, I mean, it is a kind of educational process. I think that's right. It's a way of leading people where they don't necessarily want to go. And I think that's kind of interesting that some of the rhetoric that even becomes almost elitist, unlike perhaps Connolly's rhetoric and, Larkin's rhetoric, which, but also in some ways strangely like, suggests that, well, what you've got to do is mobilise people. Now, Yeats isn't necessarily trying to mobilise people to revolution. He's trying to mobilise people to imagination and the imagination of a state. Certainly, he was a nationalist as much as many. But I think Yeats, on the other hand, stops short of saying that this must only be propagandistic, because he faces the same fight that Seamus Heaney and others have fought or faced, that once one becomes a kind of spokesman for a nation, or alleged spokesman for a nation, you maybe only have freedom to say limited things that a particular a would-be nation wants to hear. So I think there's a kind of interesting anthropological aspect to this, that one can go back in the past and look at how culture comes to be formed and use all those arguments about going backwards, as well as in very, very different ways, creating a new modern culture, which Yeats was trying to do, and Pearse, in his own way, of course, was trying to do. It's a way of, in a weird way, it's a way of making it new in Ezra Pound's terms. I mean, music in particular, I'm interested in. It always seems to have this cultural force, even since Plato. Plato thought music had the power to do things, which is why he bans musicians from his Republic unless they do nice martial hymns, or two modes are allowed only. But those kind of soft, languorous modes that might make us fall in love with each other is something that Plato bans. So why that's true that people think of music as like that, maybe it's because it is, but philosophically it has a long tradition of thinking of these things as potentially influential and therefore potentially dangerous.
Yeah, there's one more question over there. Oh, Mary, did you have something to say to that? Yeah.
Think about that. First of all, I think I hadn't actually thought of things along these terms, but there's a very strong interest in a story, and Irish people in this period, and probably a lot of other periods, just like a story. So hence the interest with literature. There's also the question of people like Pearse and MacNeill, who themselves saw a direct connection between their involvement in the Gaelic League and the formation of the Irish Volunteers. But that's partly because on discovering the richness of the Irish past and cultural tradition, they became indignant at the way in which Irish people were seen as stupid, essentially. So it gave them a kind of a self-confidence that ultimately led on to they're wanting people to assert themselves, to be proud of themselves and to assert themselves in that sense. But obviously once you move into various other forms of cultural activity, maybe to pick up some of Adrian's points, I think as to what a play would mean, it meant different things to different people, and whereas some people like Pearse, I think, would be quite happy that his students would go on to do the real thing. But for somebody like MacNeill, this was self-indulgent in a sense, and he resented the element of performance involved in Pearse's thinking. And he once said, there is no such thing as Kathleen Ní Shúile nor the Sean Van Vocht. So it means different things to different people. But certainly the discovery of this kind of wealth that seemed so different and exotic as well. In Pearse, in some of the poems he produced for the Irish Review, before he got onto the really nationalistic ones, he had previously had another series of poems that he had written notes with, and was trying to convey the Irish spirit as it was seen to be encapsulated in Irish literature and Irish folk songs, and convey this as being intensely emotional and at the same time being crafted, and would argue then that people who produced folk songs were in a sense able to produce something that was artistically quite sophisticated. So it gave them that sense of pride, and then going with that, the sense of indignation.
Okay, time for one more here. Did someone? Oh, hang on, there's 3 people have their hands up here. I don't know which I think this was the order.
Oh yeah, just to add one particular snippet to that particular discussion. The materialist Connolly, while he was waiting execution, was arranging for a publication in the United States of an edition of his ballads, and he saw this as supporting his widow and and children.
Well, I guess what I was going to say is that when you look at post-colonial literature after 1945, there's always, you know, you read Senghor, they always were in Morocco or Algeria, all over the world. There always is references to the Irish literary revival. And I'm just curious what your take on, I mean, beyond the usual stuff that we would see, that, you know, here's a cultural nationalism, if you will, as opposed in this country where revolutionary nationalism in the 60s was extolled in contrast to cultural nationalism. That's an American kind of dichotomy. But I'm wondering, you know, what the latest kind of views of this are, not just sort of, you know, resuscitating old tropes, but what do people see in a more critical way now about that?
I mean, for instance, mine was a Yeats-centric talk, and people have tried to write Yeats out of the story for good reasons in some ways. But I don't know how to answer the whole critical climate of post-colonial writers. All I would say is that last year was a year devoted to Yeats. It was Yeats 2015 because it was 150 years after his birth. And actually, although the Irish government spent a pittance compared to what they're spending on 1916, in terms that did have a real cultural reach around the world. I can't explain it necessarily, but it had reach in India through the Tagore connection. I was in Korea where they're obsessed with Yeats and other things, Japan and as well as America and Australia and these other places, in a way in which, say, for instance, in Korea, they have their own national story about partition that relates to Ireland, but also their own war, and aren't interested so much even in the formation of a national culture. They're interested in the poetry and its translations and Yeats's use of the East. So I don't know. I mean, in some ways, the Irish government got it wrong by spending so little on Yeats and so much on the rest of it in terms of the global reach. But why that's true, I can't answer it, only that it seems to be true. I mean, Yeats was early on in the game. He writes in English. All these advantages are helpful, I think. He's a Nobel Prize winner. All these things help. But yeah, he is, of course, mentioned even often in reaction. You know, Achibe's, you know, novels quote Yeats's poems, maybe in reaction to some of what things Yeats is standing for, but nonetheless there's a connection.
Yeah. I think some of the cultural activists like Pearse and MacNeill initially were unclear as to where it was all going, but they did envisage a period of, one could say, public education, and in this their views resembled those of Thomas Davis in the 1840s, who envisaged a period of education and an increasing sense of nationalism that was going to lead on to something else. So how exactly, that wasn't at all clear. However, I think there is some evidence that people like Pearse and MacDonagh and others felt the cultural movement had reached its limit by 1912. And that undoubtedly there's a sense of urgency because of other factors like the Unionist challenge. But it's clear, for example, that I think that from the quote I gave from Thomas MacDonagh, that he felt that the country was going downhill despite all the Gaelic League and other activities. And it's also clear that MacNeill was getting a bit rattled, for example, at how the Gaelic League paid a lot of attention to rules and regulations. And he mentioned this, and we know that he mentioned this because Pearse refers to it in his publication on Bor Bua, where he devotes quite a lot of time to commenting on MacNeill. He says MacNeill is quite right to talk about the Gaelic League obsession with red tape. So this element of the limit to the cultural movement possibly had reached its limit by that time, and the fact that it may have reached its limit and may have been obscured by other events that intervened that appear to be what triggered the revolt ultimately, like the war and the Unionist opposition.
Yeah, I think that I'm really sorry. I'm getting signals from here that we have to close up now. Have we time for one more? No? No? Okay, I'll do the British thing and say right out. Can you ask Adrian and Mary afterwards, after the session's over? I'd love to thank both of you very much for being such a